So welcome everyone to these curated conversations, which are a part of the closing activities for A Sexual Culture of Justice, a research project, a human rights activity-based project that's been going on for the past 4 years. And my name is Angelique Nixon. I'm a lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, and I'm also the project lead researcher on this human rights project for the past 4 years, which has been a university and community collaboration. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the project as we begin. But I just want to say that this is a two-part conversation. Today we start off with how do we transform approaches to gender-based violence and LGBTI discrimination, and we have a wonderful and amazing group of people who we'll be talking with today, all who've participated in different ways in the project. And then we continue next Wednesday with our final conversation. What's next on the LGBTI agenda for justice? And so we'll talk more about that very soon. And so, moving you very quickly, again, this is what we're doing today. And please be sure to register for next week. All of these conversations will also be broadcast live on Facebook. And as a reminder, we have folks who are here on Zoom with us. Use the chat, engage, ask questions, but we will have Q&A at the end. And I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers for today. I would love to give and present all of their beautiful bios, but we're going to do a very quick introductions today. So we have Renuka Anandjit from IGDS Ignite here with us, and she worked with the project team on GBV training, media creation, as well as community actions, and you'll learn more about that in a few minutes. Unfortunately, Jeremy Edwards could not be with us today from Silver Lining Foundation, but we are in the good hands of Renelle White, who is also on the board of Silver Lining and has worked with the two main activities that we'll feature today that Silver Lining Foundation ran, including teacher trainings and a school survey. We're also pleased to have WOMANTRA's founder and director, Stephanie Leitch, who worked on a number of different activities with us, as well as Èlysse Marcellin representing both CAISO and WOMANTRA because, you know, that's how amazing Èlysse is. And we also have, Èlysse has worked on many activities throughout the project. Amilcar Sanatan, who's representing Commonwealth Student Association, but he, in a previous life, he was a part of IGDS and also worked on IGDS Ignite. And so he's going to talk a bit about some of the student activism around these issues, and also his own work. And he also led one of our community actions and participated in the GBV training. And last but certainly not least, my co-conspirator in many things, Attillah Springer, who her and I came up with this radical notion to go and protest Tim Key way back when, before this project, and that led to a number of different actions and protests and trainings that Attillah and I would then do together, and she helped co-develop and really design the GBV training that we did as a part of this project. So we will dive in. I want to first just acknowledge Colin Robinson, our dear friend, colleague, mentor, and he was really, he was the main sort of push for this whole idea of doing this project. And so I put up some images, you know, 4 years ago when we started this journey. You can see Colin there presenting what we came and developed together. Colin really insisted on us working together, and he made us collaborate. And so we actually, to develop this project, we spent about 4 or 5 months working weekly, putting ideas together, making sure things fused, and writing our proposal and working on budgets, which was originally designed as a 3-year project, but we had to get an extension because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I just wanted to share some images of Colin as we're dedicating these closing activities to him and to remember him. And I know that his spirit is here with us. And I think, you know, you can't get much better than your MP Bullen, but you can't get rights yet. That Colin wanted this to be one of our shirts, as it was an old CAISO slogan, and we brought it into Sexual Culture of Justice. As you will see, the whole idea and the methodology of this project was about fusing our organizations together and making our work happen and using the people that have money to do it. So yeah, just briefly before we start our first question, this is just giving you a little bit about the project as a reminder. Many of you would know this, and you can certainly get all this information. But just to say that IGDS, we partnered with 6 LGBTI and feminist organizations formally, and we also had a number of other partners. So CAISO, Friends for Life, I Am One, Silver Lining Foundation, Women's Caucus, and WOMANTRA. We also partnered with Say Something TT, which is a loose network that started with Attillah and I many years ago. Caraman, Caribbean IRN, which is a regional network that brings ideas, information, and resources together on diverse genders and sexualities. And Transgender Coalition of Trinidad and Tobago, which was registered and formally came together after this project started, but we became a fast partner with TT Trans Coalition. And you can see as I move through and just give you a sense of the methodology, one of the ideas we had when we came together in a room, 6 organizations trying to think about what we wanted to do, different organizations brought to the table, well, we want to do a teacher training, we want to do a police training, we want to make sure we do an LGBT policy agenda, we want to do these kinds of activities. And so we brought them together, and our main methodology was, how do we create materials, toolkits, workshops, and research that really support our calls for gender and sexual justice and other kinds of legislative changes. We wanted things that were rooted in empowerment, transformational education, feminist praxis, and creative action. And so this series is really about highlighting some of this work and also talking about what next. We want to reflect on what worked, what didn't work. We want to highlight successes, challenges, and we want to look to the future. Just to kind of ground us and think about some of the public messaging I wanted to share, these are some of the messages that come out of the different activities that we've done over the past few years, and you'll see these come up again and again as we move through. And to our first question. So I wanted us to start thinking about, well, what's really changed over the past few years around our approaches, because one of the goals of this project was to think about how do we transform and ensure that we have locally rooted and also very regional analysis to some of our most pressing problems, especially as we've identified it in this project, gender-based violence and LGBTI discrimination. One of the central big ideas was, how do we make sure that we're addressing sexism and homophobia through all of our actions and activities and make sure that it comes through in our research. So I'm going to start us off with calling on Stephanie and Èlysse to begin, and we're going to kind of share different images as we move through. So I think I'll jump, Èlysse and Stephanie, you can I've brought images to kind of provoke conversation and thought. The 2 things we thought about today that we wanted to mention, of course, would be what's happened in the context of decriminalization, actions and activities around that. And we also want to talk about the DV amendment and protests against gender-based violence and the rise in femicides. So why don't we start with Èlysse? You want to start us off?
Sure. So thanks for that, Angelique, for the introduction, and as well for, starting us off. And I think, when we ask this question, what has changed? I think a lot has changed and a lot has also remained the same. And I think what's really instrumental is, you kind of introduced this by discussing Colin's role. And I think that his role is really kind of pivotal to understanding what has changed, because he was also able to sort of bridge a divide intergenerationally by bringing in young people into the space as well to do something different and to start a new legacy of activism. And I think the kind of turning point for all of this would have been the Jason Jones case against the government, and specifically focusing, of course, on the buggery law and the section 16, which would have focused on indecent exposure. And when we sort of look to that case, that I think is a sort of a really clear example of what has changed, because prior to that, there had really been no litigation as a form of advocacy, specifically as it relates to LGBT rights. And the victory in that case, I think, is a very important one for us to understand the role it played in kind of also bringing other organizations or other groups into the space. I mean, we were introduced to a colleague to both WOMANTRA and CAISO, Johanna Reyes, who has been instrumental in a lot of the work we've done. And as a young member of the activist community who has now been able to also take up space and demand justice in new ways. So I think that what's really sort of a critical sort of turning point here is the way in which that case has allowed advocacy to also flourish. And of course, we also saw that year the emergence of the first public pride event. And we were all instrumental in playing a part in seeing that reality. And you'll see in the picture, there's a photo there of me, Colin, Angelique, and another gentleman whose name I can't recall at this point. But that was our first action when we were first thinking around the issues of the religious folks who were protesting the Jones case. We decided in that moment, well, actually, let's protest them. I had messaged in our sexual culture justice chat saying that why don't we protest them? And Colin's like, yeah, let's do it. And then the four of us, we just went outside of Parliament to protest the protesters. And from there, I think the energy grew. It just continued to blossom, and more people came together to say that this is unacceptable. Our rights need to be respected. We need to have space where we are seen as full people and that we are deserving of justice and dignity. And that transformed into the Pride events that then eventually emerged and have been continuing since then to now. I'll leave it there for Steph to contribute as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Èlysse. And thanks for these images, Angelique. It really helps us to remember what has happened because it's been so long. It's been several years of this work through the project. So yeah, just to build on some of the things that Èlysse would have said, again, I think that, Colin's kind of bold approach to activism shone through in some of the activities that we were doing, which, as Èlysse mentioned, was to protest the protesters who were actually protesting the gender policy, which is kind of wild because they somehow linked the gender policy to decriminalizing homosexuality. So this was even before the Jason Jones business. And they were protesting weekly outside of Parliament. And we were like, nah, this is not acceptable. We have to be in the public space. We also deserve to take a place, which also ties into Colin's kind of conceptual framework of sharing the nation, right? He talked about that a lot. And yeah, just also to talk a little bit about the Jason Jones case as well, which is that he was obviously a single individual who was challenging this legislation. But what the Alliance for Justice and Diversity did, which is, the coalition made up of all of our organizations in this project, was to really rally popular action around this case and to rally the LGBT community in a way that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for our involvement. Like, I know that we printed like hundreds of t-shirts, which we were able to, give out to all of the folks who we were able to rally to come out on the streets in front of Parliament, both at Independence Square as well as the High Court, which really gave a strong show of solidarity. And the media was able to interview many different people who were not part of the activist community and were just members of the LGBT community who felt that they now had a space and a voice and felt recognized for the first time in front of the law.
Yeah, and so you'll see on the screen that I've put up some of the work that we did, and that's what I wanted to really highlight. Even though we weren't a part of the case, we rose to what the public needed. So engaging media, we put up these 5 points that we ended up getting articles about. We did a press briefing with media so people could understand after the judgment what now. So we did it before the judgment when the evangelicals were quite vocal and there were no other public voices around it. And so we did that work. We were all a part of ensuring that hundreds of people came out in front of the High Court as well on the day of the judgment and briefing the media after. And I want to sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go
sorry. I just also wanted to juxtapose that kind of public mobilization and advocacy with some of the more invisible work, work that is actually invisible but also perhaps obscure. So, for example, when there was a joint select committee around the national sexual harassment workplace policy, a number of our organizations would have been asked to be witnesses in that engagement. And what was really interesting is that this national policy actually acknowledges stigma and discrimination against LGBT people, which is something that the general public would not be aware of. But also, I think an acknowledgement by the government of our organizations, but also about our expertise to give feedback to the government about how they can be more sensitive and inclusive. And an even more recent example would have been the kind of backdoor advocacy, again, which Colin was very well known for with independent senators and other politicians around the domestic violence amendment, and thinking through how can we ensure that all people, regardless of their sexuality or gender expression, be included and protected by the domestic violence amendment. And there were some wins in there. I don't know if I'll have a chance to talk about it
Yes.
later.
I
I'll
can
stop
move us
there.
right there. But yeah, since I'm just trying to move us into our next question. But just to also highlight, I wanted Stephanie to talk a little bit more about the DV amendment, but also kind of connecting it to this action that happened last January, which, in response to femicides that we began 2020 with. And then we were able to do a lot of advocacy on the domestic violence amendment. And so I've put up some of the images here from WOMANTRA's campaign. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah, well, WOMANTRA has always been known for its public advocacy, and Orange Day, which was the image before, was a part of that, and kind of responding in real time to emerging crises. Um, and yeah, in January of last year, there were 3 back-to-back murders of women, which we thought was obviously unacceptable. And so we would have partnered with other organizations in the women's movement to have this kind of public event. And we've seen how the public has really needed that, particularly, in the most recent example of Andrea Barat. We have seen literally thousands of people getting involved, just regular people, the rank and file of the population, to speak out against violence against women. And I think that some of the work that WOMANTRA has been doing over the years has helped to build that momentum. And yeah, so to speak directly to these amendments, as you can see in the most left graphic, that the definition of domestic violence was extended to include anyone in a domestic relationship. So that would include couples who are living together but not married, as well as people in dating relationships. Now, this was important for many reasons. So vulnerable groups like teenagers, for example, who are not married but are in relationships, something like this would help to cover their relationships, which is something that our legislation really hadn't considered, because a lot of it was focused on child protection, but not necessarily teenage folks who are in consensual relationships. But also this dating relationship clause left a kind of loophole that could include same-sex loving persons. So
As long as they're not living together.
right, so I was going to get to that part.
Yeah.
So it only applies to same-sex persons who don't live together, because the definition of cohabitation in our legislation still has the language of living together as husband and wife. So we see that the discriminatory language remains in the definition of cohabitant, but there has been this kind of loophole that has been gifted to us, who knows if it was on purpose or not, that could at least allow members of the LGBT community to apply for a protection order.
Thank you so much. And so I wanna move quickly into some of the work of the student activists on campus, really led by IGDS Ignite. Both Amilcar and Renuka have been a part of this. So Amilcar, why don't we start with you? I don't see, why am I not seeing Renuka? I know she's here. Oh, here you are, Renuka. I'm seeing you now. Well, Renuka, why don't you start us off and then Amilcar jump in?
Okay, thanks, Angelique. And hello, everyone. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk quickly about the work of Ignite. So we've been very busy in the last couple of years, and a lot of our work has really fed into the Sexual Culture of Justice project. We've done some direct collaborations also with the project. But before, let me just backtrack a little bit and give you a little bit of a background on what IGDS Ignite is. And it is a student club out of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, and we brand ourselves as a youth-led social justice undergraduate group. And we do have quite a mishmash of, very interesting students, persons who are very passionate about the work that they do. And we have students from across faculties, across different campuses. We have from law school, med-sci, and even, we even have people from engineering. So we've got like a nice blend of students that really kind of serve to kind of highlight intersections in our work and different perspectives. And we also, one of the major projects that we have out of Ignite is the Cat Calls of UE project, which focuses on street harassment and gender-based violence on campus specifically. But we have expanded our audience to outside of campus because we realize that while campus is a microcosm of the nation, we do get stories from former students, and people just identify us as a safe space, and they come to us to share stories and just experiences. And even as recent as the lecturer issue that we had last week, where there was a lecturer who was accused of sexually harassing students and also just clients of his, we had some students reach out to us and say that, they were one of those persons, they were included in that group. So what we've really managed to do is really create a safe space for persons to come to us and share stories, and also just offer solutions too, because we do have that kind of engagement where we're not always offering advice, but we're welcoming perspectives and different contributions. And this is actually was actually started by two of our undergraduate students, Kelsey Joseph and Tia Marie Lander, who are still very active, and have really managed to grow a lot in this work and their own profiles. But also, some of the work that we've done at Ignite, and I speak specifically to two actions that we've done in collaboration with the Sexual Culture of Justice project. And one of those was our Chalk Back UE, which was an action on, we did it in 2019 during the 16 days of activism. And what we did is we basically took over the entire quadrangle of campus here, and we invited persons to come to share their stories, to chalk all over the quadrangle. So you might see like one of the chalkings here you're seeing, well, I was followed on campus. So we had the quadrangle just completely covered with that. But we also did activities. We had society and solutions. We talked about consent, and also we ran videos that the project produced, like the Men Speak Up videos. And those were also a really good resource for people who were just passing around. We had people standing around wondering, kind of looking, who were just wandering past, but then they still had something to go to. And then we had these really great t-shirts that was like a really nice kind of draw in for persons too. But also the messaging on the t-shirts were very strong, and people resonated with that. So, those were some of the things. And then we had also in the following year, the Orange Day activity, the Orange Day of Remembrance activity that Stephanie and Èlysse spoke about, where we went out and we talked to persons on society and solutions. And we even had like walking installations, mobile installations, where persons were wrote down their solutions and pasted it on the bodies of our different students. And all of these activities have integrated gender-based GBV into the conversation, but also we ensure what we do is that we ensure that there are intersections of GBV with minority groups and diverse groups, and we ensure that we include those topics in the conversation. And what has really been heartening in our work now is that it's a default. So now that as we're talking about, as we're planning events, or so we're always thinking about, well, what about LGBT perspectives, or, you know, how do we include diverse groups in the conversation and the work that we've done. So we have really tried to mainstream these areas into our work. And actually recently, as last 16 days of activism, we had a Generation Equality Youth Perspectives Forum, and where we did invite me and Nixon, who's a member of Ignite, but also the vice president of Pride UE, to do that, to do a presentation. But we took it a step further and we offered mentorship also. So what we did is we reached out to Cherise Berkeley, who's a part of Queer Corner, and Cherise has been doing activism for a number of years and also advocacy at multiple levels. So we kind of, so we took it a bit further than just the work. So we wanted to kind of provide that intergenerational mentorship for them. So these are some of the things that we're doing, and we're teaching as we're going along. We're offering capacity building as we're going along. And then, you know, we had around the Andrea Barrett case, we did organize a protest. We had the Right Your MP campaign. And the beauty about the Right Your MP campaign, it's not just about writing around the Andrea Barrett situation or just about, you know, violence against women. The project really gives people the opportunity to write about whatever issues that they want to write about. So, you know, these are some of the more major event actions that we have put out there just as a part of mainstreaming LGBT and GBV perspectives into our conversations. And even our International Men's Day, we had, as part of our campaign, we had trans men and queer persons as part of our campaign, as part of our panels. So, you know, we've been doing a lot of work, and it's really good to see how students are taking leadership on these issues and are really integrating these this aspect of work into the general work that we've been doing. Amilcar?
Thanks so much, Renuka. Amilcar, dive in.
No problem. Thank you very much, Dr. Nixon, and thank you so much, Renuka, as well, for the great work that you continue to do with IGDS Ignite. I think I'll just speak a little bit more broadly in terms of what is the significance of a student movement today and the work of organizations like IGDS Ignite. And there's no luck or accident that young students have been part of the social organizing we see with feminist justice groups, and the university could be a site for political socialization. One of the important contributions that students offer is an analysis, bringing words such as femicide into the popular dialogue in Trinidad and Tobago, what Ni Una Menos does in Chile and Peru. We see young women here organizing queer women to talk about sex-based violence against women that exists in our societies. And then we have the historical knowledge about femicides during indentureship, femicides during the plantation economy, and the denigration of African women. So this is a situation that we have where students play an important role in sometimes influencing the language to put back or push against the patriarchal language which come to define the terrain of what we understand as our society or culture. So therefore, protests offer young people a site for pedagogy, where they go and engage the public on ideas. They teach as much as they learn. And that is an important relationship that they develop, because one of the developments we have seen in a number of the activities we take place in, I am like the older youth in this space now, and 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds will walk up to you, or somebody will bring the little sister. Yeah, we now get police permission, we organizing a vigil. Oh yes, this is my friends from sixth form school, and we have an organizing event here. So we're seeing that the protest could be a site for political socialization, not just to judge them by what they are doing in 2021, but where they will be politically in terms of their consciousness in 2026. And that is why longer term and medium term projects are very important in creating an ecology of justice, that sexual culture of justice that this project that Dr. Nixon, you were so important to in pioneering, to develop a culture of justice. So why is that extremely significant, I think, to the duty bearers, because I just don't want to talk about the students, is that what language shows, as Stephanie's discussed earlier, is the ordering procedure around language. What is cohabitation? to neglect and deny the rights of persons from a particular sexual background or orientation. We see how domestic violence and family violence, when we engage with duty bearers, is meant to eliminate the issue of men's violence against women and girls. So students play an important role in sometimes exposing the institutional language as young researchers, as graduate students, who could understand that type of institutional ethnography, being political activists, to really say that the terrain here is unequal. And if we engage in the language, which might be strategic at times, it really puts the burden of responsibility on the public, or the way a woman dresses, or on how much street lights it have on a corner for an urban planner, rather than the government and the state. So that is why students, I think, play an important role. And the last point is that idea of a passionaria for justice. We have the capacity to build these passionate fighters who believe in this project of justice. That hope is something that is important to any political project. And what the IGDS has shown is that it's one of the few institutions that can sustain independent student activism around a political project of gender justice. How many other situations we have like that in the Caribbean that is not influenced by a state agenda, that is not suffering because it is under-resourced or does not have the technical capacity, as well as the secretariat skills? The IGDS effectively functions as a secretariat to support the work of Ignite. And therefore, in 10 years' time, because this organization was established in 2016, we are at the 5-year mark. In 10 years' time, we might be asking new questions about what is not just the face, but the form of feminist student leadership, and seeing that we could create a counter narrative to the male-dominated student governance models we have throughout the world, but particularly in the Caribbean.
Thank you so much, Amilcar. When we're moving, you start us on duty bearers. So this is a perfect moving us into to this question. We really wanted, a part of the kind of big idea of this project was to make interventions with different kinds of duty bearers who were identified as police, healthcare workers, teachers, and counselors, as well as families, thinking about how do we create public awareness on these issues. And so I want to dive right in on just prompting Stephanie to talk a little bit about some of the work. WOMANTRA has led our conversation on activities, really working with police, but also has stepped up and done some action campaigns that show one of the things that the project did at the end of the last year is to fund and support action campaigns around different kinds of intersectional issues. So this is an example of one of our action campaigns that WOMANTRA led on refugee rights and gender-based violence. So Stephanie, if you could talk a little bit about this, and also even share a little bit about our current, we're doing a campaign right now. This happened during 16 days of activism, but we're also running a campaign right now that's our final one.
Yeah, thanks for that, Angelique. I think again, WOMANTRA is specifically positioned to do certain types of front-facing work, because a lot of the agencies that work directly with migrants, like the IOM, the UNHCR, the LWC, I'm using all the acronyms, Living Water, Community, the Refugee UN Agency, UNHCR, etc., are bound by a lot of rules and regulations where they can't really engage with the public around their work because of protective issues of migrants who are obviously a vulnerable group. And WOMANTRA, through the SCJ project and through Angelique's guidance, we were really kind of encouraged to do this type of campaign because it honestly didn't exist, which is always a good reason to do something, to really try to shine a light on not just the ways in which the migrant communities are stigmatized or discriminated, but also to take on a kind of holistic approach, to talk about cultural similarities, to try and give some kind of historical perspective around why Venezuelan migrants came to Trinidad in the first instance. And most importantly, for me personally, was to show solidarity with the not only the Venezuelan but Spanish-speaking migrant community. I think that there were obviously some issues with that because, you know, in this project, we weren't able to, for example, translate everything into Spanish. And we have been trying to tweak that methodology with other campaigns, like our current campaign, Rights Deconstructed, where we are developing Spanish products, for example, but not sharing them on our personal platforms, but partnering with La Casita, which is a migrant network run by Spanish-speaking migrants, and then they will share the content with their networks, acknowledging that there are limitations, you know, in how we are communicating with migrant communities. Again, you know, around this idea of intersectionality and vulnerability, WOMANTRA is leading in another SCJ campaign called Sheltering Adolescent Access to Sexual and Reproductive Health, which is really looking at the specific policy and legislative barriers that prevents adolescents from enjoying their full human rights in relation to their sexuality and their sexual health. You can check out the Sexual Culture of Justice Instagram because we started rolling out yesterday. So you can catch that, and it's also complementary to WOMANTRA's current campaign, Rights Deconstructed, which is actually looking at the National Sexual and Reproductive Health Policy, which was approved last year. So these two things obviously feed into each other and affect each other as well.
Thank you so much for that. And Èlysse, can you talk a little bit about well, we've had challenges and some opportunities with working on the police training toolkit and the police academy. If you could say a few words about that and yeah, some of the lessons there.
Sure. So, I mean, you know, the reality of working with the state sector is that you have to have the right person. You have to be in contact with the right person often to get something rolled out, or you have to have the full buy-in, and sometimes that can be difficult. And so for us over the course of the 3 years, it has been a bit difficult to try and really and truly get this project rolling. And one of our challenges has been that liaising with the Police Training Academy has not borne the fruit we expected it would. Essentially, you know, we've tried to engage them to try and figure out what is the most practical way of rolling out a training of this scope and of this format. But it didn't really turn out how we had anticipated. And so fortunately, because the gender-based violence unit was launched in 2020, we've been able to pivot. Of course, there would be benefits in having, you know, police in particular have the training required to understand how they could address gender-based violence across diverse populations, specifically among the LGBTI population, where, you know, there are no current legislative protections and very, very limited policy protections for LGBT people. It's important to be able to actually offer training to the frontline responders who would have the responsibility of interacting with these populations. But considering that, you know, the original plan didn't quite work, we have been liaising with the gender-based violence unit and taking their feedback to consider what is the most strategic approach to developing this training. And so the methodology actually has kind of changed. And there's a few tangents to why this has changed, not least of which is the fact that through Outright and the Frontline Alliance project, WOMANTRA would have already developed a police training toolkit through that initiative that was, or rather not a police training, but a first responder training toolkit in which police could technically have access to that training as well. But what we have been able to focus on instead is, well, the question about discrimination is sort of broad. And how do you make people care about people they don't think deserve anything more than their resentment or their contempt? And so the switch to me as, you know, now handling the development of this toolkit as the consultant who will be continuing to finalize the toolkit over the coming weeks. The question is, well, what's missing? And I think in discussions with stakeholders, but more particularly in sort of thinking through our own experience with working with the police, I think one of the fundamental gaps is that we still have not appropriately addressed the institution that is policing. And so because the institution that is policing is intended to uphold class differentials, it is intended to uphold existing policies and legislation, they actually do not have the power to act inimically to the mandate that they are expected to operate within. So even though the Commissioner of Police might say, well, yes, we are welcoming LGBTI community members to make reports and to reach out to the GBV unit and to get their service from us, the reality is not that that's what happens. And in many instances, we get reports of people who may have attempted to use the relevant channels and they were not afforded the service that they should have been. So I think one of the questions here is, how do we essentially create another form of awareness in police officers that isn't explicitly fixated on sex and gender and understanding these sort of broader concepts, but is instead more focused on understanding their responsibility as officers, and how can they sort of treat every client with a certain level of sensitivity and care, irrespective of their gender. So not focusing on gender, because the reality is as well that you may experience another marginalized community member, and they may not be a member of the LGBTI community, but understanding that all people, irrespective of how they present or who they are deserving of dignity, of respect, of care, of sensitivity in the way that you interact with them, helps us to recreate and to shift the general ethos of policing. But then also one of the the key areas that I would like to incorporate as well and to properly build out in this version is also this idea of police officers as humans first. Because I think sometimes when you're in a role where you are stripped of your humanity and expected simply to follow orders, you forget that as a person, you have your own sort of desires for how you would like to be treated. And you forget that you have your own idea of integrity and of justice. So it's kind of trying to shift gears a bit, moving away from sort of the more, I suppose, theoretical or conceptual ideas about justice relating to gender and sexuality, and kind of shifting it more to this sort of human lens where we are seeing people first rather than the labels that they may carry.
Thank you, Èlysse. And that ties very nicely to, I just want to mention a few things so we can move on to our third question. One of the things when you talked about, a culture of care, thinking about the person first, that was the methodology we used for an online healthcare training. We had to pivot with COVID. This was something that the Trans Coalition pitched along with Friends for Life as one of our actions that we, planned a year ago, but we had to pivot, and we ended up having it online, and we had over 80 participants. Ray will be with us for conversation number 2, and so she'll talk a little bit about that experience because it was really her brainchild, and we were really fortunate to work with Dr. Khatija Khan on this, and we were able to have a 5-day training and work with over 80 healthcare professionals. And I just want to talk briefly, Renel, you can jump in here to say a little bit about, in terms of the question around duty bearers, the work that Silver Lining Foundation has done with the teacher training and also with Stronger Families. If you can say a few words, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the survey and the training in question 4. Go ahead.
Hi, good day, everyone. Thanks, Angelique, for having Silver Lining here. So most of you already spoke about, I would say, projects and activities that you all did on the outside. Silver Lining had more of a role or task to really try to sensitize and address issues on the inside, being inside the schools and also within the homes. So our teacher training workshop, this is a nice picture with our very first cycle, I believe it was.
Yes, it was our first one.
First cycle. With some of the teachers that we did engage with and train. So the teacher training workshop, my colleague Earl will speak a little bit more next week on the Stronger Families project, but I'll still give a little insight into that. So the teacher training workshop was really geared towards trying to transform or create safer schools as a safe space. A lot of students have said in our survey that we did in 2018, that the school was not a safe space to be. Just the same way that a lot of LGBTI persons say that the home is actually very ironically not a safe space as well. And we know and we see and we recognize that these two spaces, home and school, should be safe spaces for youth of whatever sexual orientation and whatever backgrounds. But it has proven to be particularly harmful and unsafe for LGBTI youth. Teacher training workshops were quite a culture shock. We actually had a chance to engage with teachers, educators, even guidance counselors in cycles after this first one. And some of the interventions, I would say, that came out of this as it related to LGBTI discrimination and creating awareness and so on related to GBV was that teachers recognized the need for this in their schools and for the addition to it in their curriculum. Their principals, their deans were not so much concerned or even aware that bullying and gender-based violence was actually taking place in schools. So it really did start or provided a catalyst for that change in curriculum and education. It was a bit difficult to actually gauge what actually came out as interventions. This is why we have to continue doing these teacher training workshops and also to continue engaging the teachers that we did engage in so we could really monitor and evaluate and see how much of what we did through the workshops, the sensitization and education, actually made concrete, tangible changes and impacted students. A lot of them came in, like I said, as a culture shock, and I'll be very honest to share some of the comments and responses from teachers. They
Can we share those when we talk when we focus on the survey? Okay, great. I just want to move us to through the questions. I just wanted to highlight these two activities that Silver Lining Foundation led, and as Renelle was talking about, that kind of inside the focus. Obviously, with Stronger Families, these were private and confidential sessions. We wouldn't have any photos of those, and you know, they all helped us to make those connections to be able to really support, offer support, and create a methodology around what that support looks like for families, for guardians, and also for individuals who need that support. And we see that throughout the work of a number of the new programs and projects that LGBT organizations are taking lead and building on this need, because we know it as a need. And so figuring out how do we create those spaces. So I want to move us into question 3, and don't worry, Renelle, we'll come back to getting those lessons learned as well, especially with the school survey. And I want to turn our attention to Attillah Springer, who is, again, I said earlier, my co-conspirator in putting together the GBV training as a part of this project, because Attillah and I had worked on other campaigns. We had worked on and really brainstorming ideas on how do we work with men around issues of GBV, and how do we create a methodology and a peer-to-peer training, which we ended up writing into the project. Amilcar and Renuka also worked with us, and so I'm going to just move us through some images, and Attillah, you can give us, share with us a little, what do you think worked, what didn't work, what lessons did we learn, and I'll start us off with some images and move us through. Thank you.
Remember to unmute. Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Oh, no.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, right. Thanks for having me as part of the panel, and definitely thanks for having me as part of the project, which I would say started off with true violence in terms of writing the proposal and being part of the putting together of that that document, and not being in spaces where you have to deal with things called log frames. I was very traumatized by the whole thing, but it came out of an understanding that this was work that really desperately needed to be done, And it was something that we had been talking about for a while, Angelique and I. And I had actually started talking about it, I would say, in Carnival 2013. Why is it that there was so much focus on women protecting themselves as opposed to men taking responsibility for their behavior? And sort of bringing men into the conversation, I feel, was really what was missing from a lot of the dialogue that was happening within certain spaces in terms of addressing gender-based violence. And it really bothered me that there was no space for men in the conversation. And sitting and talking with Dr. Peter Weller from Carryman as well, and trying to figure out what were the barriers to men being involved in the conversation. I feel it was a very eye-opening conversation for me to sit with Dr. Weller on more than one occasion and just sort of reason things out. And also talking with Rondell Benjamin from the Bois Academy about how we perceive violence in our society. I remember there was one particular incident that happened when we were organizing the protest against Mayor Tim Key, and we had prepared this press statement. And within the press statement, I believe that I had written something along the lines of, yes, we need to address legacies of violence, inherited legacies of violence from colonialism, enslavement, etc. And I remember someone on the committee being really concerned that we were talking about race and raising these sorts of issues, and realizing, particularly in this project, and trying to insist, because of those experiences that we had had on the ground with organizing things, that if we don't talk about race, if we don't talk about class, if we don't talk about colonialism, then we can't enter into a conversation about violence and why violence exists in our society in the way that it does. So so I think that this work is so uncomfortable. This work is so disturbing in so many ways. Even up to last year, we were still having conversations about how the work is supposed to impact, who the work is supposed to impact. Are we at a place where we can say, all right, well, this work is done. It's far from over. But I feel like there are small ways that the conversation is advancing. I feel like the work needs to continue in multiple ways. I feel that this is something that I see as somebody who is seriously invested in communication, in how easily we communicate with people. And I feel as someone who's outside of the university that there are occasions when I feel like people are being given way too much information at the same time. So I know Angelique and I butted heads many times, and I was like, take out half of the writing. And she would say, no, but we have to include it. And I would say, no, it's just too much. It's too much. And, we would butt heads on a few occasions about what, how things looked. And I remember, I just feel like design always needs to be like primary focus, and I think in the last year or so, I've been looking into design thinking as a way of making changes in terms of social change. And I feel like looking back now, this project would have benefited from a more design thinking approach in terms of creating a prototype, going, testing it, going back, rebuilding it, taking it out again. But I mean, of course, that means that you need to have a little bit more money to do that kind of thing where, you go, you test something, and then people say, well, that's tata. And so you say, all right, okay, well, let's go over and let's do it again. And how can we strip it? How can we strip it back to make it, really meaningful, really just get to the heart of whatever the matter is, and I feel like this is something that we need to do in movements across the board. We sometimes as activists, as people who are deeply connected to an issue, we want to give everything so that we won't get catch, and the media won't say, yeah, but Ole didn't say this, and and then somebody else will say, yeah, but Ole didn't say that, and Ole exclude this person, and so like we take like a very sort of try to do too much with one thing, and I would say that one of the things that really was perhaps the most successful, two things. One was Pull Up Your Brethren, and to the point where I'm hearing, men on the radio, like on those urban radio stations, talking about pulling up your brethren. And so it's not that we want to be reductive in our messages, but we also want to just zone into the thing and crystallize it in a way so that people really, yes, exactly, Paul, the hashtag, yes. I remember somebody had a placard in a protest saying nobody loves Timky, which was really brilliant. Things that stick in your head when you when you want to see something. I mean, leave she alone, leave me alone. Those kinds of rallying cries for a community. I think that they are really important. And so I just feel like the next time a project like this is going on, one of the partner organizations needs to be an advertising agency. And we need to insist that, advertising agencies do this as part of their corporate social responsibility, because, everybody's affected when it comes to these issues. I mean, where's the organization of doctors who's looking at making proper identifiers for gender-based violence within their practices? Where, so it goes beyond the duty bearers, like the police, the teachers, etc. It needs to be everywhere and everybody take it. I mean, even taxi drivers. I was in a taxi the other day, and there was that issue of this makeup artist who had done makeover with Sasha Cosmetics, and the makeup artist had a full beard, and I think there was equal parts celebration and condemnation on the Facebook page. And I was in this taxi in town, and the taxi driver was maybe like in his 50s, older Indian man who, looks, wasn't wearing his mask properly, etc., etc. So, you can make, me in my middle class nonsense can make certain value judgments on this gentleman. And then the people on the radio, he was listening to Urban Chutney Station, people on the radio were discussing, they were saying, this one particular woman was, she was saying, yeah, what's the issue with this man if he wants to wear full makeup? And the taxi driver, he said, yeah, I mean, I don't see what the issue is, and why can't we just let people live? And I was like, wow, that's so progressive. Anyway, so I took my phone out and I showed the taxi driver the photograph of the of the makeup artist. And the taxi driver stopped in the middle of the road and he was like, "This is a thing of beauty." It was a really beautiful moment, I think, for me, because I think as activists, we despair and we feel like the work that we're doing isn't penetrating in particular ways. And this is a very frivolous example, but it's the kind of example that we need to remind us. I mean, also I was in rural Trinidad a couple of weeks ago in a bar, and two older men were having a conversation about, you know, why these men have to be killing these women. It's not right. You know, if she don't want you to no more, just leave, just move on with your life. So the conversations are happening. And I feel like there needs to be two things happening, that we need to be reaching people where they are in one way, and we also need to be reaching people where they are in another way. So yes, absolutely, there's all this policy and you know, the training that we designed for these frontline workers, or these men to be partners and champions in their communities. I really wish that we could have had, you know, 500 more young men, because I feel like, you know, they would have, they're the ones who need to do the transformational work. You know, somebody was saying earlier that, I'm sorry, please forgive me for rambling, but somebody was saying earlier that, you know, we need to push for a culture of justice, because I feel like activists need to be constantly trying to work themselves out of a job. I feel like having looked at my parents and people who I know have been doing this work for the past 50 years. I know Jackie is in here, I believe. Auntie Merle, Sheila Rampasad, you know, Hazel Brown. You know, I feel like as Amilcar points out, we need to build this culture of activism at the student level, and so that when you go out into the world and you become a decision maker, you have this preparation, you have this consciousness within you. So it's not just about the gender students having the consciousness. It's also about the engineering students. It's also about the students who are working in farming. It's also about so that everybody then becomes an activist. Everybody then understands what dismantling patriarchy looks like from their point of view. So it's not just about sociologists and doctors and lawyers changing the society. It's everybody working actively to change the society. And we can only do this by, one, co-opting the media to our side. And the media is like extremely difficult and also lazy, sorry to say. As a media practitioner, I feel like I have the right to say that. And you know, and also, yeah, making every space a space for radical change, making every space a space for challenging how we see the world and how we see what's going on with the world. Mm-hmm. So that's my rambling thoughts there.
Thank you so much, Attillah. I think Stephanie wants to jump in, but I want to also just give a shout out to Attillah's work and idea that we ended up co-writing and creating, which a part of the action with the GBV training was to work with men on these messages, right? And that's where Pull Up Your Brethren came from, and Attillah's idea around doing consent doubles. And that also, I think, is another one that became very wildly popular and has taken off on its own. Someone has sent it to me and said, "Oh, have you seen this?" I was like, "Yeah, man, I saw that." So I think that's another, you know, what you brought to this project, Attillah, was making sure that we were, you know, we were rooted in many ways. And so thank you for that, and thank you for your insights. Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, it actually just started to rain quite heavily, so I hope you guys can hear me clearly. I want to echo a lot of what Attillah has said. but also to say that I think there is a turning point that has happened or that is happening, specifically with service providers and frontline workers, or at least that has been my experience, because WOMANTRA has worked not only with police officers, including those from the GBV unit, but also members of the Victim and Witness Support Unit, who are civilian psychosocial workers, as well as health workers, part of IOs like Red Cross, but also nurses working in the RHAs, for example, a wide cross-section of frontline workers. And also with teachers in my past life when I worked at the UNFPA around these or similar issues. And what I have found, well, at least with folks that I've interacted with, because I'm sure obviously they're diverse opinions, the general sense is that folks want to understand. They want to know how they can be more sensitive. They want to know how they can be more inclusive. And the point is, they just don't know. Perhaps they have never interacted with a trans person in their life, or they're not, they have no LGBT persons in their family. And the only thing that is informing their prejudice is, other things that they hear from their friends, who might be homophobic, or they might see a caricature on a TV show. And so we are really responsible. It's our responsibility as members of the LGBT community, as most of us are in the Sexual Culture of Justice Project, to really try to sensitize folks who are open to that. A lot of our energy is often, battling with people who are hateful, and I don't really find that to be productive. But to find the individuals who really are decision makers or who could have an impact on our community and the wider nation in general, who are open to having that kind of training and growing their own sensitivity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie. I want to say too that that's what we found with the healthcare training. I was really pleasantly surprised that so many of the healthcare professionals were very open. They shared when they were confused. They asked very deeply intense questions that they maybe they wouldn't have asked in person. So I thought it was interesting that the online environment offered a space for people to ask those hard questions and genuine confusions, because they didn't have anyone in their lives. And so, it was very eye-opening. And we've created a whole training that I think any of us can take up and continue to do that work with different facilitators. And I think that's the important part too, that this project allows us to use the materials that we've created. And I'm going to kind of keep moving us through so we can get to our last question soon. And as Psyche is saying to everyone in the chat, please do put your comments and questions, log them into the chat so you don't forget, and we will address them during Q&A. But I wanted to give Renuka an opportunity to share a little bit about the community action. You already mentioned some of that, Renuka, so maybe just share any additional thoughts or insights you might want to at this time, because we had a kind of 3-tiered process for the GBV training. We did the training, then we created media that was led by the men and facilitators and participants, and then we did these community actions, which Amilcar led one and Renuka led one. So let's start with Renuka.
Thank you again, Dr. Nixon. So yes, like I mentioned, this was our first Chalk Back activity that was hosted during the 16 days of activism, where we invited students. We had we distributed prizes in the form of the T-shirt. But what was most important is that we were able to have conversations with the general student population, which I think is important and feeds into what Attillah was talking about and Stephanie about these kind of community conversations. Where one of the challenges that we have right now, and something that we talk about in Ignite, when we see a lot of the activism that's happening, a lot of the activism is happening in cyberspace, and there's a huge part of the population that is disconnected from that. Sometimes we're talking to each other and we're not necessarily talking to the people who need the information, So one of the things that we've been doing and kind of taking from the project, thinking about the Men Speak Up campaign, is how are we introducing those conversations in certain circles, especially around engaging conversations around masculinity and talking to men. It's about, in a post-pandemic, I don't know when that'll be, but we're trying to see how we can really kind of go into different groups now, school groups, community groups, and so on, have those conversations with them around gender, around sexuality, around GBV, you know, on the intersections of these issues, because we think it's really important to have, you know, that kind of those conversations in different spaces and with those particularly key groups. So not just about the people who were, you know, who are lashing out at us and coming with the hate and so, but it's about people who are very open to those conversations, because indeed, you know, you go around, you walk, you talk to a man or a woman in the street or so, and people do want to know, you know, they're just not sure where to get the information. They don't necessarily have the information. So, you know, that's why it's important for us as student groups to integrate outreach into our work, which is a key component of some of Ignite's activities. But I wanted to say also, just taking from the project, especially the Men Speak Up campaign, you know, those were some excellent resources. Those are some excellent tools, those videos around the consent doubles, around the one that was, what's your name? Call me by my name. Those are excellent tools that we have actually taken, and we have been using them as teaching tools in 2 of our courses, at least for, you know, Introduction to Women's Studies and Men and Masculinities, that's taught by Dr. Hussain and I, and we have found that the students respond really well to them. They like the lightheartedness of it, but they're able to take that really strong message and run with it, you know, and it really does spur a lot of discussion, especially in tutorials. And so people are going to be a little resistant, but it really works well. And it also, you know, taken from the project, it has also helped to think us at Ignite to think about how we work with men. Who are the men that we're targeting? How we're having these conversations, you know, where we're mixing like the academic and the concepts to, you know, to actually just having like more on the ground, more of a grounded approach. And also just thinking about how, you know, feminist language and feminist concepts have been really mainstreamed in the conversations and the discourse, which is really good for us in terms of people being open, and they're taking and they're absorbing the information. But, you know, it just shows like we have a lot more work to do, and there are opportunities for the work, because we're saying sometimes they're co-opted and then sometimes not. But, you know, it's really good that people are reaching out and really touching, making those connections. And one very important thing I want to talk about here, I'm not talking about like one thing after another, but it's just, you know, taken from the experience and the learning that we have managed to benefit from the mentorship of under the Sexual Cultural Justice Project, and also just advancing some of our work, is how we have done work around advancing gender justice on campus. And especially for us as a student group, we work a lot with the Guild of Students, and after much lobbying last year, we were able to do gender sensitivity training with the Guild Council, where we included conversations around gender-based violence on campus, and also attending to the needs of LGBT students, thinking about working opportunities, identifying opportunities for the Guild to really improve the situation on campus, and also meeting student needs. And, you know, and then we are currently working on creating a gender seat on the Guild of Council. So there's never been one. There's only Mona who has a gender representative on the Guild. So right now we're working on developing that. And I will say, from the work that we have been doing over the years, the Guild is very receptive to it. They're working along with us. And hopefully in the next, in 2022, we will have an official gender representative on the Guild of Students. So really these networking, the mentorship opportunities, the skills building, the mainstreaming, you know, all of these, they're really kind of provided opportunities for us to really explore the intersections of these, of the work, but also to really advance these notions of equality and justice in our work. Yes?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Renuka. Amilcar, I want to have you jump in to talk a little bit about your action. The image that's up is an action that was led by Bois Academy. And so I want both, Amilcar, you could talk about your action, and then we'll wrap up with Attillah. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And what we would have facilitated was looking at one of the interventions was on red card rape culture, which is to get men to understand consent, as also the issue of rape culture as a sociological concept, where men contribute significantly and create an environment that puts women at risk to sexual violence. And that requires some analytical work, which is to provide the context, because the thing about prejudice, it is anti-intellectual. It goes against the data to tell us what is the reality. And then it also discusses their attitudes as individuals. But what is transformative is that we have peer-to-peer learning. So one of the first things I want to value in the work that we did in this project is to understand the role of local knowledges and community practice. So that is why organizations like the Boa Academy and the mythology of the stick fighter as well, but also the community building around it, and how we could think about spaces where men may have gone to traditionally as well, or find a sense of value and community could also be places for gender equality work, thinking, and consciousness raising. Another component is why men need to have mediated conversations around men. We see in this backlash moment, men demand a space. As Dr. Hosang says, they want feminist concepts, but don't want feminist content. So we see persons, men saying, I need a space for men, men need to talk. And yes, they should talk. But when they reach in the little hole, what are they talking about? And that is the type of mediation, how we could have a feminist mediated conversation, a feminist inspired one as well, where it's not a place to reproduce privilege, power, and rejection of women's rights and the rights of girls, but to seriously think about masculinity. And men don't just convene as men, they seek to understand themselves as gendered beings. And therefore, we play an important role, because if you look at the photographs there, is that this is an opportunity to provide an example and an ethic of what a man can be. I know we must trouble the idea that men don't give up their privilege. Men have serious, not just hesitations, but no interest in gender equality because they lose their standing in men, among men, sorry. But on one aspect, it is definitely gendered, but on another, it is political. The idea of taking a political risk to go against what a status quo will give you as your interests requires us to build a political community and constituency of people to feel when they stand in solidarity with you, it's not just them alone, that they would have people to defend them. So part of the work of having men speak up on gender justice and to facilitate dialogue in community with the women's rights movement is to build an example, but an ethic of the new type of construction of a society we want. And just the 4 key areas that came forward quickly, Dr. Nixon, is that I think this process allowed me to reflect on how much men were willing to give up on their humanity for being a man. And that is something we need to trouble with in terms of our language and what we try to do in our mobilizations. The second issue is how we must use women's leadership to undermine male-centeredness in the conversation, because the question we are troubled with are men gatekeepers for gender equality, and we need to problematize that question and then see what types of different models and examples we could have to say what strategies work, when and where and why they don't as well. Then we look at how to engage men who don't identify with hypermasculinity. Because sometimes, and this is a shortcoming even on my part, we understand perpetrators, we understand victims. But there's a spectrum of men who engage in a range of perspectives, of a range of performances. And we need to have conversation with men. It's not like, oh, you never beat somebody, well, you have no problem. You're not the man I come for. There's a wider type of intervention we need to have with how men engage around this work of gender justice. And the last one is, it has shown us why intersectionality is important, how much capitalism and economic strain govern people's lives and make men identify with our economic system to maintain social power in a harmful way. We need to have wide conversations, not intersectionality as a sub-issue, but as something that features through all our dialogue to get men on board.
Thank you so much for that. I think that intersects so well with the work that, working with Rondell Benjamin of Boa Academy. He also pushed us around how do we have these conversations, and if you want to design a training using Kalinda, how do we think through that? And we had some really hard conversations as well. And he ended up we featured an interview with Rondell about this idea of becoming a champion against gender-based violence. What does it mean to do that? And he used He used a lot of the Kalinda technologies and teachings and principles to be a part of that. So Attillah, I want to just give you the last word here before we move on to the next question. Any thoughts as we reflect on the GBV community actions? Anything for us to think about into the future?
Yeah, no, I really appreciated what Amilcar said about, us troubling our position in the work that we're doing and questioning ourselves, questioning our allies and partners, really doing the self-work as well, and challenging the nice guys, the people who aren't doing the violence but are doing the violence, because in lots of ways those people within and without our communities are people who are trying to make change. They are the ones doing like a significant amount of damage, and sometimes we are the ones doing the damage, and understanding how we create harm when we're trying to heal is also an important part of the work that we need to do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Absolutely. So we're going to focus just for a few minutes on the teacher training and school survey. I'm mindful of time, and I want to encourage everyone who's on Zoom with us, please do put in your comments, write in your questions. We will have time, and we will have an opportunity to hear from everyone really briefly when we wrap up. But Renelle, I wanted us to really think about the teacher training and the school survey. The teacher training happened in 2018 and 2019. The school survey also happened at the end of 2019, and then 2020 was really focused on the analysis of those of the surveys. But just a few thoughts on the teacher training, which I just want to say for context, the Silver Lining Foundation wanted to lead this teacher training based on the 2016 survey that Renelle mentioned earlier, as a way to say, okay, these are the experiences of young people in our schools. That was 22 schools, and we want to design a training, and then we want to go back and do another survey. And so that was the logic and the methodology of the approach. And Silver Lining has also done is continuing to use the toolkit that we created together, and it will continue to be a part of Silver Lining's work. Renelle and I were both facilitators for the first 2 cycles of the training. So Renelle, if you want to mention anything here before we talk about the survey.
I think it was Renuka mentioned that activism is taking place in cyberspace, but bullying is also taking place in cyberspace as well. Cyberbullying is definitely a thing, and that was one of the things that we took away from not only the surveys but also while doing teacher training. These 2 activities were very, how should I say it? They weren't so much a form of those lovely activist type sessions and events and activities that Attillah and Amilcar and Renuka and those did, but it was so much more technical in terms of the survey itself being a tool or a mechanism to capture data, because years ago, before the survey was done, the Minister of Education said bullying doesn't take place in schools, and cyberbullying, gender-based violence, gendered bullying, LGBTI bullying, that's not a thing. LGBTI people don't exist. We have been hearing these things over and over and over. And that is why the survey came about, really, to really get that data, to provide the authorities and the stakeholders and show them that, you all are saying these things, but the numbers show differently. The experiences of the students show differently. As you can see here in this image, we call it the National School Climate Survey. There was so much red tape around language. There was a lot of resistance from the governments, from school bodies. We could not have put on the cover LGBTI bullying at all.
Well, it's supposed to be gender-based bullying. Yeah,
gender-based
that's the name
bullying.
of it, but we had to change it. Yeah, it was
We had to
supposed
change it a little bit.
Gender-based violence and bullying in secondary schools, but we had to
Yeah,
take that out, and we could put we couldn't put anything about LGBTI, anything
yeah,
in the front
right.
material.
So that in itself was a form of, like watering down and silencing these experiences and the whole fact that the LGBTI community exists and should be valid and validated. So, like I was saying before, the teacher training workshop was really a culture shock. Many of the teachers came and they were like, "Oh, we didn't know this was about gay thing. We didn't know this was about LGBTI. You all should have told us before." We felt hoodwinked. We felt deceived, because the title of the survey, the teacher training workshop, didn't state anything like this. And maybe if they had known, they would not have come. So I think we could say that teachers, the school environment, the education system at the primary school level, because we trained primary school teachers, they were quite resistant to
Secondary school. It was
secondary
secondary school. Yeah, we didn't do
Yeah,
any
what did I say? Sorry.
primary.
Yeah, secondary. I know that.
Secondary.
I had coffee, but I don't know what's going on. Yeah, secondary, definitely secondary school. So they were quite resistant. However, they stayed because the principal sent them, the dean sent them, so they have to stay for the 2 days and report back. So we were glad that they did stay. And at the end, we did see that they were willing. They said, "You know what, we didn't understand. We have never been exposed to something like this. We haven't been trained in gender, understanding sexuality, understanding identity, diversity, inclusion." These things that we brought to the training, the modules included sensitization around gender and sexuality, around understanding diverse identities, understanding diversity and inclusion, and how to actually create or build classrooms that facilitate differences and inclusion of persons who are of different needs. Two other modules included conflict resolution as well. And lastly, which Angelique did such a great job at, was restorative justice and healing. So all these different modules made up that that whole sensitization and training, where we really try to understand what teachers face, what they go through, the gaps and so on within the curriculum, and fill in that gap, and not only training and teaching them about gender and diversity and sexuality and the LGBTI experience and LGBTI persons and so on, but to really change or shift paradigms around how we deal with conflict, how we deal with punishment. And we chose to adopt an approach of restorative justice and healing, because we did not want the bullies, because this was a lot about bullying and gender-based violence, like we mentioned. We did not want, for example, the bullies to not be granted or given that right to their education. So as opposed to, suspending and expelling and kicking out of school and all of that, we wanted to, keep them in, understand where these conflicts and the bullying and the gender-based violence came from, and actually help teachers engage in more of a restorative approach to heal, because persons who perpetrate bullying and gender-based violence, they themselves had probably encountered some sort of hurt or harm, because they say that hurt people, and we really wanted to recognize that and not stigmatize or punish those who have engaged in such behaviors, but understand and create that safe space for healing, restorative justice, and really have the school, which is where young people spend most of their days from 8 to half 2. This has to be a safe space for students. And if we create safe spaces there and really change that culture from that early young age, we would have a society of adults who could communicate better, who have healthier gender relations, who are more understanding and so on. And it would definitely go towards decreasing or addressing what we are seeing currently now in our society: gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and bullying and so on. Yeah.
So I just wanted to, I see there are some questions about were there trainings in Tobago. Jeremy's in the chat. Welcome, Jeremy. Thanks for being here. We did have teachers from Tobago come for these these 2 cycles of trainings in which we trained 46 secondary school teachers and counselors. And I think I just wanted to add to what Renelle is saying too, that the counselors especially, I found them to be really wanting solutions. They wanted help. They wanted to think about, well, how can I make the classroom safer? And also because we were able, Jeremy did an overview of the report, the lessons from the first survey, so that teachers would understand the context. And what we found is that so many students who had experienced bullying and violence based on their gender presentation or their perceived sexuality then started to bully as well. Some of them started to engage in bullying to protect themselves. And the teachers said, that's what we see too in the classroom, and they wanted solutions. And so one of the things that we did, there was the toolkit that the facilitator, we created for facilitators, but we also created a handbook with different exercises and different ways that the different tools that teachers could use in the classroom. And that was something that the teachers and counselors got to take with them. And they also got a lot of resources from us. So I wanted, so we can move to our final question as we wrap up and then open up, because I see there's a number of questions in the chat already. Renelle, if you could say a few words about the survey. It's completed, the analysis has been done, the report is almost finished, and I know that Silver Lining will do an official launch of the survey perhaps in April, as I understand it.
Yep.
But just for us today, if you could share just a few insights about the survey, and then we'll move to our closing question.
Yeah, okay. So as Angelique said, the first launch of the launch of the first survey report was in 2018, and we wanted this to be a 3-year cycle to continuously go to schools and do these surveys every 3 years to be able to monitor, evaluate, see if anything has changed. And it worked. It was supposed to work in tandem with the teacher training workshops. So the survey should ideally reflect some sort of positive change if the teachers we have trained and want to continue to train actually implement these techniques and so on, and use the tools to create safer schools. Because the survey, initially, the first survey did show that the school itself, like I keep saying, was an unhappy, unsafe space. I have the executive report here. We are not sharing too much of the survey
We just
right now.
Let's just share a few things. So that 42 schools were surveyed.
It was 42 schools. Let me get my notes here. Right. Yeah, so it was approximately 40 schools, 2,300 students approximately. It definitely revealed that need for sex ed. We saw that around 15% of students were dealing with sexual assault. Half of this could not even identify if what they had experienced was sexual assault or rape. And that also reflected similar numbers from the last survey itself. What else? Again, in 2019, the second survey, 17.3% felt that the school was not supportive or inviting and felt that it was unsafe and unhappy place to be. There was continued to show high levels of physical assaults. Male students were shown to be perpetrators more so of gender-based violence, and we could marry that data with the activism and so on that Amilcar and the others did around transforming masculinities and manhood and what does it mean to be a young boy in school. So the data did show this. Face-to-face and word-of-mouth teasing were more prevalent through the use of, rather than through use of phones and social media cyberbullying. However, cyberbullying did occur. Girls were more likely to be targets of bullying, of being teased online and on social media. Boys continue to engage in ostracism of peers. Reporting continued to be low, right? So again, if we don't have the reports, then the teachers, the guidance counselors, they would not know what's actually going on with the students. Guidance counselors continue to say that, you know, they don't hear about these things, and the students themselves, through the data, said that they felt like they couldn't talk to their teachers, they couldn't speak to the guidance counselors. So that is a big barrier in terms of how do the educators, the guidance counselors, authorities in the school system, how do they provide more of an open space to really accommodate students being able to come to them and speak to them about these things. What else? 9.5 experienced sexual violence. 5.3 were perpetrators of said violence. The majority of students did not perpetrate or experience sexual violence, but it is still there. 1%, 0.1% is too much. We want to have zero. We want to reach a place where there is zero violence, zero sexual violence, zero GBV. Interesting. Greater percentages of boys reported being touched in private body parts and body areas without consent, and of receiving sexually explicit gestures than girls, although boys also did most of the touching. Interesting results. What else? 4.8% of boys, 8.7% of girls reported verbal abuse and insults if they turned down sexual advances. Students continued to report that they were being harassed based on sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation, as well as their perceived gender identity. And this continued to reflect what was reflected in the 2006 data. I think that is a really big thing. It's a big deal. What is happening in schools? What is going on when it comes to homophobia and policing of one's identity and sexuality? We see that students, they don't know a person's sexual orientation, but because of homophobia, because of stereotypes and stigma and this whole culture that we have where we normalize bullying as a corrective mechanism, the teachers also reflected, hey, well, you know, these students sometimes they be acting too gay. You know, they need to take the gay down. They need to be not so flamboyant and take it down and thing when they're in schools because they're just looking for the bullying. So we see so much of victim blaming, and the teachers themselves tell the students, hey, take down the gay when you're in school if you don't want to be bullied.
And in fact, we had a number of the scenarios the teachers would ask us, well, what am I supposed to do when this happens, right? And we would be like, well, okay. But you can also see how sexism and homophobia function so clearly together in these different experiences. So I noticed we're at the 20-minute mark, and so I just want to move us. We have some really exciting questions, and I want to echo Stephanie and Èlysse are both congratulating Silver Lining Foundation on this really excellent and important data collection. And a good comment that's coming through the workplace from Linda. The workplace encourages you to take down the gay as well. So this constant way that we are being policed around sex and gender, I think is something that the project overall really wanted to tackle in terms of how do we transform harmful gender and sexual norms. And so I want us to just say, everyone take a minute or two to wrap up some thoughts and comments, especially on what does the future look like in this work towards a sexual culture of justice? What do we see our work being in the next number of years? And of course, we're going to continue this conversation with part 2. But I want to, who shall I start us with? Stephanie, why don't you go first? And I will do a to move us to the next person. Or you can tag the next person as well. That would be great. Thanks.
Okay, sure. I'd like to start by acknowledging WOMANTRA's former director, Khadija Sanatan, who I see has joined us. She's a very hard lady to pin down. I'm glad that she's joined, particularly because she was involved in this project as well. So yeah, I think that WOMANTRA has already kind of started thinking about, well, not started thinking about, but we continue to do the work, right? But how can we think about these specific policy and legislative openings, like through the Domestic Violence Amendment, for example, lead to further data collection and evidence gathering in order to push the agenda forward. So WOMANTRA is currently in partnership with Outright Action International, which is a global LGBT organization. And part of the work that we're doing in partnership with them is doing some monitoring around how LGBT persons are actually accessing protection orders. So there's this possibility now, as I'd mentioned, that same-sex couples can use the dating relationship clause to access protection orders. So we want to monitor, how many people are actually doing this so that we know whether or not the mechanism is working. I think in the Caribbean, we're often working without data and without evidence. And because we represent a particularly vulnerable group that is also a minority group, it really falls on us to do that type of data collection, like the Silver Lining Foundation has done with their really excellent work around bullying and school violence. What else can I say? I think that WOMANTRA will continue to focus on femicide, as we have been doing for the past decade and more, and really bringing the lives of those women into the conversation. I think that has been a special contribution of ours, saying their names, invoking their memories into our activism work, because a lot of times, this work can feel generic, talking about these heavy topics, policy, legislation. I know Attillah was saying, she wants to pull her hair out sometimes. But yeah, like really remembering that these are real people, real stories. The families who are left behind with the carnage is just so terrible, just for the mental health of the entire nation. And some of the things that I've been trying to think through, at least for the past few years, is how we can really try to develop this idea of having advocates. So someone who can accompany a person to a hospital or accompany someone to the police station, for example. And we've kind of been informally doing that work, but with the International Women's Day March that just happened, we have a bunch of new volunteers who have expressed interest in pursuing that. And so we really hope to try to build out some kind of navigator advocate system within the next year or two, to help folks navigate this really complicated system of getting state and NGO assistance. And I know that the Wholeness and Justice Project of CAISO has already been doing some of that work. So I envision that we'll have continued partnerships as we move along. So I'm gonna tag Attillah.
Right. I just want to wish a peaceful transition to Colin. I want to give thanks for his relentless optimism, for his brilliance, for the way that he could inspire you to do things that you didn't want to do. For his dry sense of humor. For doing work that was ugly, was uncomfortable, that none of us thought that we could do. And by example, making sure that we did the work. I just want to give thanks for him and give thanks for the energy that he gave to all of us when we didn't think that our voices were valid. Yeah, give thanks for Colin.
Thank you. You want to tag somebody to go?
Renel. Unmute.
You have to unmute.
Sorry, thanks, Attillah. made us all very emotional. But thank you so much for recognizing. Last night, Jeremy and I were talking, you know, in preparation for this. And in doing so, of course, you know, Colin came up, and as Brandon is saying here, who is a colleague of mine in Silver Lining, his legacy does live on in all of us. And what Jeremy said, and I want to let you all know and echo his sentiments as the executive director of the Silver Lining Foundation. He definitely did recognize Colin for bridging so many gaps and for setting a path forward for young people and young organizations like the Silver Lining Foundation, for a young person like Jeremy who started this, who felt like he had nowhere to go or no place to be. And you know, for this reason, as I say this, and I am getting very emotional as well, because we hold what we do so close to us, so close to our hearts. You all are all my friends. And you know, I don't even see you all as like colleagues or people I work with, but as friends, as part of the community. And he was so instrumental in building coalition, that coalition building movement. And we could continue to see the value in coalition building. And I hope that we continue his legacy and we don't let him down. And you know, all the hard things that we have to deal with at times. We know it's hard. We know it could be hard. People have different personalities and all these things, but you know, we should keep that vision in mind and continue to live through him and show that his legacy will live on. Yes, so thanks for again for providing the space, Angelique. The years of doing this work, we definitely want to see some sort of transformation, and Silver Lining has continued to work with projects and so on. When it comes to the teacher training, we want to continue building resources. So we actually will engage in creating an educator resource network for teachers, where teachers wouldn't have to wait for a teacher training workshop. They wouldn't have to wait to be sent to it for the principal to give them, you know, the okay to go, but building that educator resource network where we would have all these different resources, information, illustrations, methods, tools, and so on being circulated via emails and a network itself, where we could really reach a much wider scope of teachers. So that's something that we really want to get started on and really want to build on and work on. Also, too, currently, Silver Lining is working on a PSA that should be fun, but also very informative, around sex education and the need for comprehensive sex education. And we would want to take this as far as we could go, really showing that through querying sex education, how the curriculum, which is currently the HFLE curriculum, how it could benefit all students. It could address and mitigate gender-based violence and bullying and all these different things, through providing resources, expanding comprehensive sex education, really trying to address the very limited traditional and conventional ideas we have around gender, sexuality, identity, sex ed. Sex ed isn't just, hey, you know, okay, we give out some condoms, we tell you, go have safe sex. It isn't just about that. And a lot of people have shown their concerns, teachers and parents, oh gosh, we don't want our kids having sex, but it isn't only about that. But the future in social justice work is transforming these ideas, where we show that it is so important to empower young people, to empower them in terms of their bodies, so they could have that sexual autonomy over themselves, so they could better understand consent, to transform gender relations. You know, we want to keep disrupting the system. We want to keep disrupting traditional ideas. We want to keep disrupting bullying without disrupting, as I mentioned before, students' right to get an education. We want to continue advocating for more social and emotional learning in curriculum development, and really show how social justice learning is part of the whole child approach, you know, where that would lead to a sexual culture of justice from the school systems, from within the home, and then eventually being able to reflect within the wider society and create a more just sexual culture that we live in. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Renelle. Tagging Amilcar, go. We're running out of time, so I'm moving us quickly.
So of course I want to big up the memory of Colin. I mean, I don't know, I even believe, I think we had a bad relationship or a less developed one. We're just bad talk people, maybe some people in this chat as well. But I always tell him, I mean, it was a bad relationship. I'd say, boy, you are dead yet? You know, that's how I'll pick up the phone. And he's like, yeah. It's like, you're going to hell, Colin. They say you're gay, so you have sins. So at least I'll enjoy hell with you, you know? So we had a lot of conversations, and he showed me why closeness to life was important and why ethics was important, how listening, you know, and investing in long-term change and understanding the role of culture. I think that is sometimes we too technical and too political, and we try to impose an agenda on our societies rather than seeing ourselves as a part of an ecology of work. Sometimes we really planting a seed. Sometimes we're waiting for the right season. Sometimes you are the pollinating agent, you know, sometimes you are the river. You know, he understood that good things take time. And that was important, I think, for my temperament and the way that I do community work. And one of the things I want to put my time towards right now is what something like Stephanie did it a lot in her presentation, is around speaking to those networks of power, which has shown us that we are not isolated in our work. And then there are these nodes of communities and actors that we could really empower to carry forward our agenda. And what that would look like quickly is that right now in the Caribbean, 22% of cabinet positions are held by women. Generally across the board, 30% of elected positions are women. But the exceptions are in Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. Of course, in Guyana, we have a legislated quota of 1/3 of political nominees that must be women. So when we say 22% of women are in cabinet position, we are really saying that 78% of our political directors of our nations are men. And I believe that feminist student leadership must take its natural step into political power and leadership. And as persons in our society, we must ask, what is the relationship between the state and the people, and understanding it is politically constructed. So this is part of the work we're trying to cultivate, not just to scale up our work, but to understand that political power is an expression for what we're doing. Not just women in leadership, I think, as well, but feminist leadership, challenging men to advance feminist political agendas while they have power and leadership. And I hope that persons in this community here would continue to support that work where we are, and why Will and why the UE Guild and Costard Guild and Cipriani Guild play an important role in that.
Thank you so much, Amilcar. Èlysse?
Thanks for that. And also thanks to everyone who's contributed so far. All of you all have really offered some powerful concluding comments. And, you know, the question is, how have we transformed harmful gender and sexual norms? And I actually think the better persons or persons to answer that would be the people who feel that we have done the work well. And so I would leave that to the community to answer. But what does the future look like? I think the first thing is to honor as well Colin's memory, and to continue doing the work of building bridges that are grounded in love, justice, and authenticity, where people are able to show up as their whole selves, where there is no erasure of self in these spaces that we coexist in, and where people have the liberty to define what that self is, not on anybody else's terms or mandates, but on their own. And I think as well that we have to, as we move forward in this work, continue to sort of challenge harmful norms by transforming narratives. Oftentimes the portrayal of self is, is something that a minute elite minority might have the power to do. And they might be the ones who get the chance to determine who is what. But I think that in order to challenge norms, we also have to authentically speak truth to power and tell our stories. and redefine the narratives that have been given to us. So I think that a lot of the work that we have to continue doing is also rooted in taking back control over our stories, remembering what our ancestors did and how important storytelling was to them, and sort of honoring that legacy of the story. And I think, having people like Attillah on the call is so powerful, because I think for me personally, Attillah is one of the most powerful storytellers that I have encountered. And I believe that she has maintained that legacy from her own lineage of telling stories and really doing so in a powerful and emphatic way. And I think that there's so much to learn from people like her, from people like Amilcar, who also continue to challenge norms, from people like Renelle, everybody on this call. All of you have these really profound ways of sort of telling stories and speaking truth to power that I think we have to continue working in. And I think another thing that we can continue to do is, Stephanie touched on this, but I have to say it because this is my area of passion, is collecting data. I think without data, we can't transform the stories in the way that appeals to those who have power. And so data becomes an integral part of how we also tell those stories, so that no one can diminish your own story as an anecdote and say that it has no value. And I think that, another thing is also to continue co-creating activated populations. I think as we build bridges and tell stories, we do that work of planting seeds, as Amilcar spoke to, and really transforming how people see their own selves and their own capacity to take part in this movement. And so that they don't see it as a wave that's toppling them over, but as a wave that is taking them to a place of healing, that they can contribute to that space. And I think that leads me to my final 2 points, which would be to sort of define for ourselves, what do justice, what does truth, what does reconciliation, what do these concepts mean to us? And how do we engage in the self-work, as Attillah talked to before, to really get to a point where we are not just defining these things for somebody else to participate in, but so that we can also continue to hold our own selves accountable in this work. Because without accountability, we are essentially just barking, braying animals, or what is the word? But we have to be accountable to self and to other. And I think as part of that storytelling process, as part of that building bridges, we have to do that work of coming to our own place of healing and sharing healing, because when we continue to do this work unhealed, we continue to contribute to trauma and pain. So I believe that a very important part of the work we do has to be with the self first. And I think is it only Renuka left to speak?
Yes.
Maybe passing the ball to Renuka now.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I know in the interest of time, so I'll just move quickly. But for me, one of the most significant things that came out of, us in thinking about how we transform gender and sexual norms is just the fact that we were able, through our work, to really expand and strengthen some of our networks. So that really, gave space for us to go in, have uncomfortable conversations and kind of cause little disruptions that are provoking thoughts and that's provoking actions. And I think and I'm speaking specifically from the student perspective and on behalf of Ignite, and the fact that we're positioned within the university, it's the fact that we have a lot of young people doing this work, so there's hope for the next generation, but also just the fact that we are giving them that responsibility and allowing them to take ownership of the work, and thinking about what everyone else said, having them add to the narrative so they'll be able to really share their own experiences. So yes, they're benefiting from the mentorship, but they themselves are learning through the experience and gaining that insight in a way that a lot of us never quite did. Because for me, I think about my introduction to activism, I didn't have this level of mentorship, but I know and I understand the importance of it. So that's why it's very important for us to mentor at multiple levels. And the mentorship comes from Ignite, not just for the members of Ignite, but we also offer mentorship to Guild people from the university, the Guild of Students. They're coming to us now when they have like press releases or they have any issues that they're dealing with. And I think that is a good thing, approach to thinking about how we have contributed to on the campus to transforming these norms now, because if there's an issue, there's a go-to. They're consulting with us, and then also how they're dealing with the issues is a lot more sensitive to to different experiences and different groups. And then also just the fact that just mainstreaming feminist frameworks, that is so significant that we can have these conversations and that we can recognize this in the work, even for those organizations or groups who don't necessarily, identify or align their work with feminist principles, but we see it there in the praxis. And then, finally, just moving forward, it's about just us continuing to claim space for the work and the narratives, and also, again, I'll stress taking ownership of the work, because that is very important in advancing these notions of justice and also advancing a culture of justice. Thank you, Angelique.
Thank you so much. We have some questions in the chat, so I just want to move us as we take some of those questions. Sharon has asked, how are we going to be, using the data and the everything, the research from this project. And so I wanted to take this moment to highlight that we also did a collection of life stories that was a qualitative study of working class LGBTQI plus folks living in Trinidad and Tobago. And that work, we did a whole lunchtime seminar on that in December. And we'll talk more about that in our conversation number 2. But that just to let everyone know, all of the materials that were able to be public are on our portal.caribbeansexualities.org. And that is available. All of the toolkits that we've created, all of the education campaign materials, and all of the research will be available and be able to, anyone can take it up and use it. And I think each of our organizations, what we're going to talk about in conversation 2, especially around the LGBTI policy agenda, we've made a commitment as the Alliance for Justice and Diversity to continue doing work for the next 5 years strategically, as aligns with our work and pushing our agenda forward. And so I wanted to just give a shout out to that work. And thanks everyone for your contributions today. I think this has been so inspiring and so important. Thanks so much to Monica from the European Union, who's here and has joined us and is saying congratulations to the team. And I think there was one other question that I noticed from Vidya. So if we can perhaps take that up, where I think if I'm remembering correctly, Vidya asked about how have we engaged faith communities. And so I wondered if anyone had wanted to respond to that. I know that was not necessarily a part of the project, but aside from the work that we did in terms of the protests, we really didn't include faith communities because we had so much going on in the project. But if anyone has thoughts about our engagement with faith communities and organizations, perhaps we could share that now. And I just want to take us till about 2:15 the latest, and then we're gonna close. Anyone want to take that question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, actually, this this is really Colin's area. So we are invoking Colin in this conversation by answering this question, because he was actually the one who was most interested in building those bridges, and he would have done so during the McEwen case, when we would have had that town hall in City Hall. Yeah. And we would have invited Pastor, I have forgotten her name, but we would have had an Anglican priest on our panel. And Shelley, yes, Shelley. And she was actually the sort of the faith leader representative who was present at that point and sort of helped to bridge that divide, because it's not something we've obviously been able to successfully do. And while it is not something I would say has been a priority of any of our work throughout this project or necessarily on the table moving forward, I do think that there are meaningful connections that can be made with faith leaders who have shown themselves to be allies. But I do think that, when it comes to the question of building allyship, that work really should fall on allies. And I think often the work falls on us to build those connections, when I think it should be the other way around. So if
I think we might have lost Èlysse. So we'll give her a few moments to come back in.
Yeah, I can jump in the meantime.
Thanks.
Yeah, just to say that, throughout the life of sexual culture of justice and through various campaigns we have always seen maybe one or two voices of religious leaders coming forward and speaking in support of our work, in support of the LGBT community or against violence. And I always say to my team, hey, we should really write down that person's name. We should keep, the record of what this person said. But, it probably doesn't happen, or, it just kind of falls to the side. But I do think that there are real opportunities to follow up with these folks and to build, as we've all been saying, meaningful relationships with them. But also taking into consideration what Èlysse said is like, we're obviously inundated with work, with unpaid work. We're doing all of the things, LGBT folks in particular, and feminists typically supporting multiple movements. And so it gets really hard. So I do agree that I think, it's also a responsibility of the allies to help to build bridges. But again, Colin is here because he was the person most focused on religious allyship, but also really committed to coalition building, which is a monstrous task within itself.
Yes, and that coalition building is what we're really going to talk through for conversation number 2, to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned. And one of the huge lessons that I've learned through this project is, and being guided by Colin, is to push through even when it's messy and it's hard, and to figure out the best ways to be accountable, to say and admit when I'm wrong, like, yeah, no, that didn't work, so let's start again, let's try again, and to come to the team and invite the ideas and suggestions and be very open to change. And I think in coalitions you have to do that. We have to listen and we have to be accountable in the spaces that we work in. Èlysse got bumped off and is saying, my last comment was to invite any leaders of faith communities who would be listening to join us in building bridges. And Sharon is reminding us that Shelly Ann Tenia has provided support and referrals for almost 12 years. Also Father Harvey and others were part of the fora and ecumenical services. Thank you so much for that, Sharon, and that reminder. A place that we might want to think about working. And Luke Sinnett from Friends for Life, who's joining us for conversation 2, will probably talk a little bit more about some of their work as well with faith communities and what we may be thinking about for the future. So thanks, everyone. I'm just wrapping up quickly. This is just, just to have an hour recording. This is an overview of the highlights of some of our projects' impact. We had 18 activities over the 4 years across 7 work packages. And we had to pivot a number of times. And in those pivots, we managed to even create even more exciting activities in the process of not only of the pandemic, but other kinds of changes and opportunities. And I think we've been really successful, even with the challenges, and we've also gone above and beyond what we've promised to do in this project. And I just want to say, for all of our partners, informal and formal partners, we couldn't have done this without each and every one of you. So thank you so much. And just as a reminder for all of the, for folks who have questions, want to get in touch with us, sexualcultureofjustice@gmail.com will continue to be, even when the project ends, the project continues, right? We have a number of things that will still continue through our alliance building, which was really the point of the project. Colin wanted this project, and we did it, was to ensure that organizations were strengthened and our capacity was strengthened to do our work. And I think we can see that and more, especially which we will talk about next week. Please follow us on Instagram. You can see a lot of the campaigns and some of our work, which will continue into next week. And we will also do a kind of highlight of the project as well. And the portal, please check it out. And then finally, we invite you to join us next week. All of the folks who are part of the conversation for today, I definitely want you a part of next week as well, as we are joined with other speakers and partners of the project. And we're going to be really excited to think through the question, what's next on the LGBTI agenda for justice? And shout out to the CAISO team in particular, and Èlysse and others, when we were coming up with our, well, how do we talk about the policy agenda? And we're like, well, they keep asking us about this gay agenda. And so we ran with it. And Èlysse came up with this great talk your talk, which became our really our slogan for thinking about what are we doing in this work. And of course, the very famous homosexual agenda T-shirt, which continued to be a part of our messaging. And so with that, I thank you all, and I would like us to wrap up now. So if we could give each other a round of applause. Thank you all so much for the work.